Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As colleagues on both sides of the House have described in great detail tonight, Iran has a deplorable human rights record within its own domestic society. However, and at the same time, Iran's abhorrent conduct is not confined to its own borders. Indeed, through a range of regional proxies, illicit financing, and support of terrorism, Iran continues to extend its nefarious influence throughout the Middle East and far beyond. Its regional meddling ranges from Lebanon to Gaza to the front lines of the Syrian conflict. Its support of terrorism has been felt as far away as 2 terrorist bombings in Argentina and, of course, on the streets of Israel. What's more, Mr. Chair, Iran's insidious influence is now being felt in Iraq, where its support and guidance of Shia militias has heightened sectarian tensions and threatens to undermine the long-term stability of the Iraqi state. In 2011, the world watched as a peaceful civil uprising in Syria was met with brutal repression from the Assad regime. As Syria descended into chaos and the murderous brutality of the Assad regime became evident, Iran steadily increased its assistance to the Syrian regime, serving as a principal supplier and enabler in a war that would see over 200,000 Syrians slaughtered. Iran, along with Russia today, remains one of the strongest supporters of the Syrian regime, providing financial and political support and military supplies and training. In propping up the al-Assad regime, Iran has played a significant role in perpetuating the egregious human rights record of both the civilian and the military wings of its ally. In Lebanon, Iran continues to project its agenda through its proxy Hezbollah, a terrorist group which it has trained, armed, and funded. Iran has used Hezbollah to carry out attacks across the globe, including in Europe and in South America, and relies on Hezbollah as a part of its frontline military capabilities, both in Syria and aimed directly at Israel. Indeed, Hezbollah flagrantly is open in its desire and intention to see Israel destroyed. It continues to threaten Israel's security along its northern border through repeated incursions and rocket attacks. It continues to call on terrorist groups to join its maniacal campaign against the West. And through all of this, Mr. Chair, Hezbollah continues to rely on Iran for funding, arms, ideology, and direction. And from behind the curtain, Iran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders serve as the guarantor of Hezbollah's ambitions, with no regard for what impact that could have on the security of Lebanon or the safety of the Lebanese people. For Iran, Lebanon is merely a tool to be manipulated for its regional influence and for the extension of its terrorist agenda. Little more. Mr. Speaker, Iran's drive to inflict terror on Israel can also be seen through its sponsor of Palestinian terror groups, including Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad. Like Hezbollah, these groups' overarching goal is the destruction of the State of Israel. By continuing to fund, arm, and train these groups, Iran is directly fueling the terror tactics these groups use to improve and impose an environment of fear and insecurity on Israeli citizens. Since the last time, Chair, that this House held a take-note debate on Iran, the regime has provided more than ample evidence of its continued support for these listed terrorist entities. In 2012, Palestinian terror groups took aim at Israeli citizens with newer, high-technology rockets, enabling those groups to fire farther into Israeli territory than ever before. The origin of this technology is no mystery. Indeed, Iranian commanders boasted that Iran transferred the technology to these groups so that the missiles could be manufactured in Gaza instead of being shipped from Iran itself. Following the 2012 war, Iran continued to provide arms and rocket material to Hamas and PIJ to rebuild their stock of weapons in Gaza. And this contributed, as you know, Chair, to renewed fighting in 2014, which claimed the lives of over 2,000 Palestinians and 70 Israelis. The devastation of Gaza from the 2014 conflict has not stopped Iran from using Palestinian and Israeli lives as tools towards achieving its hegemonic goals. Public reports from April of this year indicate that Iran has resumed transfers of tens of millions of dollars to the PIJ to rebuild tunnels and purchase weapons for use in a future conflict with Israel. At a time when Gazans are in desperate need of reconstruction and humanitarian assistance, Iran has demonstrated again that its own goal of terrorizing Israel takes precedence. A further concern is Iran's continued meddling in neighboring Iraq. For decades, Iraq has been vulnerable to internal sectarian conflict, and in June 2014, this again took shape in the advance of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq in the Levant, ISIL, also known as ISIS, also known as Daesh. This group seized about a third of the country in a veritable blitzkrieg of unspeakable violence and terror. In this time of instability, more than anything, Iraq needed unity. More than weapons or ammunition alone, Iraq needed reconciliation between Sunni and Shia citizens. More than bombs and artillery, Iraq needed an environment in which revenge and suspicion could be overcome. And more than military tactics, Chair, Iraq needed citizens of all stripes to band together and restore stability to their embattled country. This is not a future that Iran would tolerate. Mr. Speaker, Iran's campaign of violence and terror has been felt throughout the region. It's also attempted to project its agenda in other parts of the world. Iran's proxies have been active in targeting Jewish communities, Israeli assets, and other opponents of Iran through a variety of terrorist attacks. Iranian agents plotted to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. They've tried to assassinate Israeli diplomats in India, Thailand, and Georgia, and have been caught providing weapons to the Houthi rebels in Yemen and the Shia opposition in Bahrain. For these and for other reasons, Chair, Canada chose to designate Iran as a state supporter of terrorism under the State Immunity Act in September 2012. This designation helps facilitate redress to victims with a Canadian nexus under Canada's Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act for loss or damage resulting from a terrorist act committed by Iran. We also chose, Chair, to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, the external branch of Iran's military, as a terrorist entity under Canada's criminal code. It is the regime's primary mechanism for cultivating and supporting terrorists abroad and has been the conduit for the support of terrorist acts. Whether looking at Iran's clandestine operations abroad, its involvement in supporting Syria's brutal dictator Bashar al-Assad, its proxies in Lebanon and Gaza, or its meddling in Iran, let alone its brutal domestic human rights violations, it's clear, Chair, that the Islamic Republic remains one of the foremost threats to international peace and security. This is far from the narrative that Iran's clerical leaders would have us believe, and I see my time is coming to a close. However, a simple change in tone, Chair, should not be mistaken for genuine reform. Indeed, in the arena of international security, actions speak louder than words. In the case of Iran, its record of brazen regional intervention, continued sponsorship of terror, funding of militant proxies makes its intentions clear. It is incumbent upon Canada and like-minded partners to continue to hold Iran to account for its destabilizing role across the international community. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Hochelaga.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Thank you very much, Chair. We've heard a great deal this evening about the actions of Iran and their effects on the people of Iran and the difficulties that that has caused. I've heard about a lot of facts that have been cited here, but what I'd like to know now is this. What is the government, the Conservative government, going to do, and what has it done, to quote the honourable member who's just spoken, who said actions speak louder than words? I would like to hear from that very same member what actions rather than words were taken.
Well, thank you, and I thank my colleague for a question which has a fairly broad spectrum of answers. As my colleague knows, Canada's direct diplomatic relations with Iran have been strained since shortly after the Islamic Revolution in 1980, when Canada enabled the escape of American diplomats, which had been protected in our embassy. For many years, from the 90s into the early 2000s, Canada had a situation of controlled contact with Iran, where we dealt only with consular issues and human rights interventions, and our participation intervening to act against Iran's nuclear adventurism. Canada does continue to speak out in international fora. We have imposed sanctions, which we have heard endorsed by members across the House tonight, with regards both to its belligerent international behavior, its support of terrorist organizations abroad, as well as its human rights violations, severe human rights violations domestically. And Canada will and should continue to maintain all of these positions and all of these activities and pressures to encourage the government of Iran to one day recognize freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law.
Good answer. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires.